Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to listen to the discussions. I learned a lot, and I hope I can still learn a lot in the rest of the day. So this is essentially a presentation that doesn't directly deal with food security, and you're probably used to that by listening to FAO. It's really something about food prices, and actually food prices from two perspectives. Starting with consumers, you don't see this here in the title, and then gradually moving into the producers. So the title only covers part of the presentation. And it is in a way, I got the perfect segue from Minister Twinheim, because she essentially said very eloquently and elegantly that the problem today is, and that's really a big difference to 2008, is that prices for consumers are really high, and consumers are facing enormous challenges accessing the food market. And at the same time, and it's really different from 2008, the input prices for producers are very high. And that essentially means that farmers are increasingly disenchanted because they find it hard to actually meet positive margins, to have positive margins, to have incentives to produce. It, of course, depends on what we are talking about, what region it is, and what production area it is, but we have these twin challenges today. And it could really mean, and that's the last slide of the presentation eventually, it could really mean that we are moving away from an access crisis, a cost of living crisis, and that's what we have today. We don't have an availability crisis, towards an availability crisis next year. I'm not saying we will, but I would like to make a few arguments that we could. So let me start with a brief overview. So as said already, I will start with the high food prices from the perspective of consumers. And I don't need to go into the various points that I will address. I will do that then. In the second part, I will try to address the perspective of producers and eventually wrap up. Good. So what is the current market situation? And as you certainly know, FAO is monitoring food prices in a very detailed way, and food prices were at the new record high, at least in nominal terms, in March this year. They have been falling ever since, as we can see here. Unfortunately, I don't have a laser beamer, but you see that anyway rather clearly. So in March, we reached a new all-time high at least in nominal terms. A good economist would never show a time series in nominal terms. It would always need to be deflated. And I come back to this because it's really important to understand how to deflate a time series. It can mean completely different things. On the right side, you see essentially what are the contributing elements to this all-time high, and we clearly see that this is mainly on account of prices for vegetable oil, which shot up due to a number of actually policy interventions, for instance, the export ban by Indonesia, but then also the high costs faced in Malaysia due to high labor costs and disrupted supply chains. And of course, we know that the two countries account for 80% of palm oil exports, and that is a big element in global palm oil prices. We also see that cereal prices went up, and that's actually the jump due to the war in Ukraine. They came down. They may actually go up a little. I would not expect that it's a lot due to the discontinuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but we could see more price action there. The other prices are actually relatively well behaved, although they're also up, sugar and meat and dairy. All of this is in nominal terms, and we will see in a moment how important it is to actually deflate that time series. Why? In a moment, I will show you one of the key price elements for agriculture, and that is the energy market. So looking at the energy markets, we actually see something that we haven't seen in 30 years. So that's a long, long time series, and that's the price for natural gas. And this volatility is really unprecedented. Natural gas prices went up enormously. TTF prices by the end of August this year were at 350 euros per megawatt hour. And they came down in the space of just 2 months by 70%, so below 100 euros per megawatt hour. So that volatility is unprecedented. And we still see that prices are above the long-term average. And they have clearly departed from the oil prices here represented by the WTI, the West Texas Intermediate price. So these prices are not only important for producers, but they're very important for food consumers because they have to pay the heating of the houses, and they are important for processors, including Yara, of course, because that's the key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizer, and they are obviously very important for producers because This means higher prices for diesel. It means higher prices for gas, like, for instance, in the Netherlands for greenhouse producers. And it means generally higher prices for all sorts of things, diesel, etc., etc. So how big is the burden for consumers? And of course, our main concern is always food security, and we always look first at the burden for consumers, and we see here essentially how big the share of food expenditure in total expenditure is in a number of countries. And it's really enormous. I know we are always concerned about food inflation in our countries, that food accounts for a very high share of total income, but this is nothing compared to many developing countries where food can account for 50% and more, up to 80, 90% of total income. And it's clear that if one pays that much amount money for food, very little is left over for other things. And how little is left over is, you will see that on the next slide, when we actually add to food also energy and housing. So that's essentially here, and there we see that a lot of countries, I think here these are 30 countries, essentially spend more than 60% of their total income on these basic necessities. And actually that number has risen to 53 countries in just the space of 2 years, and it's probably much higher now. It's probably around 70 countries. So clearly this is a cost of living crisis, and it's well illustrated here. Good. So what I illustrated here for the individual consumers, of course, becomes manifest also at the macro level. When we look into the import bills for food, then we also notice they're at all-time highs. And they have been soaring in the past. They have been soaring enormously, not only for the world as a whole. This is not necessarily our focus. Our focus is always the lower and middle income countries. And so just in the space of 1 year, they increased by 26%. So these countries are spending a lot more for their food imports. And that also illustrates the real problem of the food crisis. We just had an off-site discussion about this. What is the current food crisis? It is not an availability crisis. Actually, the world is producing enormous amounts of food. We have record production for wheat. We have record production for rice. We have record stocks for wheat and rice. We have very good production for coarse grains. So you ask yourself, if we have all these, if the world is awash in grain, if the world is awash in food, so why do we have these high prices? Well, because there are countries that are essentially able to siphon off any additional supply at relatively high prices. I don't want to zero in on any country, but perhaps to illustrate it just with the example of the biggest importer in the world, that's China. China has been the biggest importer in 2019, in January, and has doubled since then its agricultural imports. So what's happening is essentially that these big importers are pricing these smaller countries out of the market. And so the problem that we have at the moment is not a general availability problem. The problem that we have is that some countries simply don't have the purchasing power to access the market. And this is actually why FAO has come up with a food import financing facility. We call it the FIF. And now we are very happy that the IMF has picked up the idea and has opened a food shock window, as it's called. And I learned on Friday last week that the first $80 million went to Malawi that help essentially Malawi to import food. So we knew all of this from the beginning. We analyzed the situation, I think, correctly, and that's why we proposed that. Good. Let me now move to the producers. So prices are at all-time highs, and I said already, a good economist would never look at a nominal price series, particularly not if it is over such a long period of time. A good economist will always deflate. And of course, the FAO, we are good economists, we deflate. The problem here is that we deflated perhaps with the wrong deflator. It has always been good to deflate a nominal series as far as commodities are concerned with what we call the manufactured unit value. So this is essentially a basket of goods that reflects the cost of an importer that imports machinery, that imports consumer electronics, that imports cars, that imports manufacturers. And so this actually allows a country to say, how are my terms of trade evolving for the commodities I'm exporting? Simply put, how much cars and how many tractors, how many consumer electronics can I buy for the soybeans I'm exporting? Now that is, from a terms of trade perspective, a very valid question. But it doesn't answer the question that farmers are asking themselves, is it actually so that I can buy more fertilizer, can buy more pesticides, seeds, feeds, etc. for my goods? So as you see here, in terms of real prices for farmers, that would be actually a bonanza. No, they have very good prices and they should actually have a strong incentive to produce if we deflate the series with the export unit value. But it's not true, as I said already, because farmers are facing different prices. They do not care what the stereo costs or what the car costs, or perhaps some do, but in general they care about what their inputs cost. So their fertilizer, and the fertilizers are at all-time highs. They also care about what other inputs cost. And so what we do in order to capture this, we try to deflate, for instance, the output prices with the fertilizer price. And we call this the fertilizer affordability. And you've heard about this, right? So fertilizer affordability is essentially just the output prices divided by a fertilizer index. And that's what you see here. And lo and behold, prices don't look that good in terms of fertilizer affordability. But that's just one little element of the overall basket of inputs that a farmer is facing. Farmers, of course, face a lot more inputs. They face costs of diesel, they face costs of feeds, of seeds, of pesticides, of electricity, and so on and so forth. So we took that one step further and moved away from just the fertilizer affordability to a general affordability. But before going into that, let me just show you how it looks for individual products in terms of fertilizer affordability. And there you see fertilizer affordability is actually still very low. There are some silver linings on the horizon, for instance, for maize. Well, output prices are relatively good, and now we see a contraction in urea prices, so it's actually improving. That could actually mean that maize production becomes more profitable again, and that's a good sign. It's quite different, for instance, for palm oil, where, okay, urea is not such a big deal, but still, if we just look at it from an arithmetic perspective, with this precipitous fall in palm oil prices, affordability has not improved. Good. Let's move away from just looking into one input into a series of inputs. And so we constructed an input price index, which is certainly not complete, but it's the information that was available to us. And that input price index has 5 components. It's total energy in agriculture, that's electricity, it's diesel, etc., etc. So it's all the fuels, it's all the feeds, which is a very important component, particularly for the livestock producers. And I think Mr. Burcher has already mentioned that the livestock producers are in a very rough spot at the moment because they are facing not necessarily higher output prices, quite the opposite, particularly for pig and poultry producers, but they are facing enormous increases in their feed costs and hence lower margins, or some even negative margins. A lot of pig producers are going out of production because the prices for their feeds have risen faster than the prices for their pigs. It also includes fertilizer as an important component, pesticides and seed. And the weighting is not by trade, it's actually by consumption. So it's quite important to get a consumption-based index. And if we now take the same series and we deflate it with the input price index, we get a different result. Before doing that, we thought at the global level it's actually useful to distinguish between 2 different input price index. One that includes all the inputs that are produced by agriculture and the other one that doesn't. Why? And what are the inputs produced by agriculture? The seeds and the feeds are actually produced by agriculture. So if you take the sector as a whole and the world as a whole, it doesn't make sense to include these 2 into the basket of goods inputs for agriculture because they actually come out of agriculture, just as agriculture as a whole. But the moment we move down either into a country or we move down into a specific sector, this net GP doesn't make any sense. So we have to then move into the gross GP that includes seeds and feeds. Okay, so we see already, because of the enormous increase, particularly in the energy market, and particularly in the electricity market, and there are particularly in Europe, sectors in agriculture that are very intensive as far as their energy consumption is concerned, this can be a major threat to profitability. So the input price index is rising much faster than, for instance, the MUV, and particularly if we only look into the energy-focused input price index. So if one then essentially takes that food price index of FAO and deflates it with the GP, the global input price index, that's the yellow line, and perhaps even with the energy-focused GP, which is, of course, very partial, then we see that prices are not high and rising, but they're actually falling and they're low. They're not quite as low as they were in 2008, but they're not rising. And that is exactly what the minister said. So for consumers, we do not see a relief because they're still facing the high prices. But for farmers, in particular, in rural areas in more general terms, the situation isn't as rosy as it looks, simply because while they get more for the output, they pay a lot more for the inputs. And if a farmer uses a lot of energy-intensive inputs, that actually can offset much of the output. It doesn't have to. So it can still be so that the increase in the output prices way outweighs the increase in the input prices, simply when these inputs play a small role or the output prices are rising relatively rapidly. And we see that. And actually, the margins, not only the margins are high, but it could even be so that the overall returns are rising relatively rapidly. As we've seen, for instance, in the EU for wheat, everybody expected a poor crop, but it wasn't a poor crop. And so the wheat farmers benefited not only from keeping their margins, but also having more output. It's different for the maize market, which is actually more energy intensive, and at the same time, the yields were not nearly as good as it was anticipated. So again, this was the micro analysis, but we see the same at the macro level for countries as a whole. We've developed a new indicator, as it were, which we call it's a tongue twister, the input-import bill. So it's essentially the bill that developing countries in particular, but the world as a whole, is paying for imported inputs. Good, and that bill has, we saw a moment ago how the food input bill has risen. I think it was by 25 or 26%. We see now how the input bill has risen. And for the low-income countries, it has risen by 130%. So that's really, the low and low-middle income countries has really risen by an enormous amount. And that, of course, puts additional strain on their current account balance. And that's particularly worrisome because these countries are facing a double whammy, as they say in the US. It's not only that they pay a lot more for their inputs, their exchange rate has fallen dramatically often against the US dollar. And unlike in the past, they cannot benefit from this. Why can they not benefit? In the past, it was always so, yes, you essentially depreciate yourself out of trouble by letting the exchange rate go down. And that was fine, so you gain competitiveness, particularly when the exchange rate falls beyond the inflation rate, so the relative inflation rates. We call this real depreciation. That, however, is not working to the extent it used to work because the rest of the world is not growing. So when the rest of the world is not growing, it's actually shrinking in part, you cannot use your competitiveness that you've gained through the exchange rate because nobody buys your products. And that's the trouble that many developing countries are facing now. Good. So with this, just let me wrap it up. And I see that I remain within my time limits. So as Minister Twinheim said, consumers continue to suffer from high food prices. This is particularly worrisome in countries where food and energy account for a large share of the total income and the total expenditure. When we deflate prices with the MUV, we make a mistake. I think there is no doubt about this, simply because, unless we are only interested in terms of trade, simply because the MUV does not reflect the cost basket that a farmer is facing. So in order to get rid of this, we need to have a different deflator, and that's what I tried to explain. That's perhaps the academic version of something rather banal. The incentives that we normally think are now provided to farmers by high output prices are not as strong as we think. It's actually so that particularly farmers that are producing in an energy-intensive way or an input-intensive way overall, they are facing not necessarily up high and rising prices, but they're facing low and falling prices. So The big question that we now have is, with this lower affordability overall, do we move from a cost of living crisis, from an access crisis at the moment, into an availability crisis in 2023, simply because it's not as profitable as we may think it is profitable to produce agricultural outputs? And that's something we carefully watch, and we hope that this will not be the case. Thank you very much.